Well, it's good to be back with you. By the way, we're coming up to the end of September. So we've been on this journey for a bit, and I'm glad you're still with us. One of Sherry's pictures I just love, and these are the Black-Eyed Susans. The picture picked up these beautiful purple background and greens. And anyway, I just am so grateful for what Sherry does. And thank you, Sherry, for what you bring to us in these beautiful pictures. All right, and we are now entering into a very exciting part of Revelation. We are moving into chapter 12. And so we, again, every presentation I give you this introduction. The book of Revelation are the thoughts of God, communicated through His Word, that tell us that God is on our side. He is on your side. Some people think God's out to get us and zap us and all these things, and they blame God for everything, good, bad, and otherwise. But I hope in the book of Revelation we discover that God has always been on your side. So chapter 12, we are going to look at the great sign. There are two spectacular images that we are going to explore. And I want to give you this brief introduction. Once we get into chapter 12 and move through this next portion of the book, I want you to get an appreciation for the fact that God's mind, in one sentence, can move you through time all the way back pre-creation and all the way forward in time to the fulfillment of all the prophecies. That God thinks timeless. God speaks timeless. Timelessness. So our journey is to just listen carefully to what God has given to John to write. Listen carefully where he takes you with his words, because he wants you to know something happened in the past, in the present, and in the future. So I hope you enjoy this. Let's go on the journey. Revelation is God's presentation of His plan for us. When we go to chapter 12, it begins the experience of the final events leading up to His return. So the first thing we do is we get a historical overview of how it all begins. And again, I want to remind you to think of the story having the ability to move you in time as if time were fluid, like it's a lake where you can swim from one side to the other. Only you do it in just an instant of your mind. So enjoy this. I hope you have fun. So it says in verse 1 of chapter 12, there was a great sign appeared in heaven. Now, you notice I've highlighted the word great sign appeared in heaven. And I want you to notice the woman that John is seeing. Now, when it says a great sign appeared in the Greek, if we put it more into English, it would say, the emphasis, hey, look at this. This is incredible. Maybe some would say, wow, that was so awesome. So I want you to understand that what John is seeing is just phenomenal. And I'm going to have you just pause for a moment. Look at the woman there on the left of that slide. There's the 12 stars. There's the sun that she's dressed in. She's pregnant. She's standing on the moon. I want you to understand that the woman there is complete with celestial things surrounding her and clothing her, and she is in need of nothing else. She is complete. She has everything she needs. Now, why do I tell you that? Because that is so profoundly important to you and to me. Now, let's go to this next part of the verse. It says, a woman, and that's all I put in the text. So this is the first woman introduced in Revelation. The woman in Revelation, there's two. The woman is always symbolic of the church, the bride of Christ. And the women in Revelation are profoundly interesting. But this woman is untainted. It is the pure church, because she is fully reflecting the righteousness of Jesus. And we're going to get into that in the next slide here in just a moment. However, there is another woman we will meet later, and she is very different. And I'm going to point out the difference to you right now. Notice this woman standing on the moon, wearing the garment of the sun, with child, 12 stars over her head. She is complete. She needs nothing else. The second woman we meet needed in her mind something else. And we will have a lively conversation when we get to that portion of Revelation, okay? Don't want to go too far ahead. It says the woman was clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So I'm just going to walk through the symbols with you. First of all, I put in my notes, the sun is the glory of God's righteousness that clothes the entire church. I'll explain to you when I get down to the moon why I say that. The moon is a reflection of that glory in Christ. Christ said, "Of myself I can do nothing. I only see what the Father has asked me to do." Jesus manifested in his ministry the love, the agape love of God, the compassion of God, the healing power of God. Everything Jesus did poured from the Father in heaven through him to touch the lives of humanity. So the moon is a symbol of Christ reflecting the righteousness, the glory of the sun, if you would. We see that beautiful moon at night, silvery, shining moon. That is Jesus' symbol reflecting the righteousness of his Father. He was completely dependent on his Father, as you and I are called to be dependent upon him. Now, the crown of 12 stars is absolutely fascinating, because I want you to notice that this isn't a golden crown. This isn't the crown of a king. The Greek word used here for crown is Stephanos, and that was the crown the Olympic victor received. It was the most sought-after crown in all of Greece, because it was the champion, the great athletes received this wreath as a sign of their victory. So the woman wearing the crown says that the church has already won her victory. And I'm going to say that if you are in the church, you are a participant in her victory. It's already provided. It is already there. So why 12 stars? 12 throughout prophecy and Revelation always seems in the history of Scripture and in prophecy to represent God's church. So I'm going to give you a short list. This isn't exhaustive. For example, there were 12 tribes in Israel. There were 12 loaves in the holy compartment of the sanctuary, representing the tribes, each one representing one of those 12 tribes. Notice there were 12 disciples. When we look at the holy city coming up in Revelation, there's going to be 12 gates, there's going to be 12 foundations of the holy city from which the church is built on. So when we see those 12 stars as the wreath of victory, I am telling you that God is saying that his church is already promised its victory. Are you a willing sharer of that victory in Christ? Just pause that. Just let that sink in for just a moment. She has already gained everything that she needs. She needs nothing else. Notice in that picture, there's nothing else added to her in her glory, in her beauty, and her splendor. And John says, come and see. This is awesome. This is beautiful. This is absolutely spectacular. You've got to see it, he said. Verse 2. It says, she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. So I'm going to say something here to kind of stretch your thinking a little bit. When Mary conceived Christ, the Old Testament church, Israel, Mary was a member of that church. And out of that church would come what we call the Christian church today. Are you with me on this? So when she was with child, I want you to understand that out of the church comes the Savior through Mary. But in this vision of the church, we move beyond and we hear the woman here, and I am not saying she's Mary, I'm saying she is the symbol of God's beautiful church. It says she cried out, and then it says being in labor and in pain giving birth. But there's a catch here. There's something unique. Stefanovic said something interesting, and I'm resourcing his commentary on Revelation, because what he said just struck me profound. The word cried out, he wrote, is used when the martyrs cried out in the fifth seal. How long, O Lord, until you judge us? It was their cry demanding the judgment of God. Nowhere, he commented, is the term she cried out ever used for a woman in labor pain. It's a different word entirely. And since this is an introduction, I'm trying not to get too bogged down, but I want you to notice that this cry isn't the normal cry of a woman in labor. This is a cry of the persecution of those saints that are under the altar. So my note says the word cried out is used when the martyrs cried out in the fifth seal, not the word used for a woman giving birth. This is more than just the child's birth. This is a cry of what is coming prophetically to happen to the church. And you'll see why before we finish this presentation. It says she was with child and she cried out, being in labor, giving birth. The birth of Christ would bring the birth of his new church that would suffer persecution and hear the cry of the martyrs. Did you catch that? I went through that very quickly. The birth of Christ would bring the birth of his new church that would suffer persecution and hear the cry of the martyrs. So when she cries out symbolically in this story, it is a prophetic cry. I found that to be fascinating. Now, the cause of the persecution and suffering and religious wars declared on the church are represented in the next character you are about to meet. Now, here's what's, I think, fascinating about this vision. John looks up and he sees the woman, and he says, this is incredibly awesome. But what comes onto the scene in the next moment is also stunning. It says in verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns on his head, and there were 7 crowns. Now notice these crowns are not crowns of victory. They are crowns or diadems of rulership. Horns symbolically always represent authorities or authorities that kingdoms have, for example. Okay? These 7 heads would represent the 7 final kingdoms. The 10 horns would represent the 10 powers that are going to come on the world scene. We'll talk about that later. They're actually discussed in detail in the book of Daniel. But let's continue and see what verse 4 says to us. It says, and I want you to notice the picture while I read this, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. So something happened in heaven. Okay? The dragon leaves heaven, takes 1/3 of the stars, and the word for stars can also be the word for messengers, okay, or angels in some cases. And the dragon is waiting to devour the child that's given birth. Now, how is it that the dragon did not devour the child? Remember I told you we have a sense of time coming up here? Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt when King Herod ordered all the baby boys 2 and under to be put to death. So the dragon was not able to devour her child because God sent Joseph and Mary out of the country to be safe. Verse 5. It says, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who would rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God, to his throne. Can we pause here for just a moment? We just experienced in a single sentence the birth, the calling and authority of who Jesus would be as the ruler of nations, And it says her child was caught up to God. Now we're all of a sudden moving in time to the ascension of Christ to be seated beside his Father on the throne in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6. But while that dragon was in that position to devour the child and persecution came, I want you to notice verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. We just went from the birth to the ascension of Christ and how his new church was saved in just a sentence. Actually, that would be two. Probably should edit my own notes once in a while. 1,260 days we've talked about. This is our third time encountering this timeline in the book of Revelation. Remember we studied in Daniel about this power that will speak against God, who will wear out the saints of the Most High. That was the one who wanted to devour the child. He will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half a time. That would be the 1,260 years. A time is 1 year. Times would be 2. A half a time would be 180 days or 6 months. 42 months, 3.5 years, 3.5 years equals 1,260 years of persecution. The principle of prophetic time speaks of a period, 42 months, 1,260 days of years, are all tied together in Daniel and Revelation. The book was written before the church experienced her persecution, saying that she would be protected and she would be safe during that time. Do you remember the crown of victory on her head? Remember the dragon seeking to devour the coming Christ? The reason he could not win is because God had already assured the victory for his church. And if he has assured the victory of his church, then he has assured your victory as well. God found a place for the young church to flourish in the wilderness. He has always watched over his people and provided for the church the same way he has provided for you. There is a multitude of stories of wilderness, the Waldensians who were protected during some of the times of persecution. There's the Christians who fled Europe, came over on the Mayflower. God has provided places of safety for his church always to flourish, even in times of religious wars and persecution. The reason we are standing here today is because that fledgling church was protected as the dragon has attempted and still attempts to this day to destroy the church. Thank you, Sherry. This is our last beautiful picture. Flower pictures today, beautiful flowers. I thought, when we talk about that beautiful, pure woman, flowers are always important. I thought we would do flowers for Sherry's pictures today. This one, to me, is just like totally spectacular. The colors, just lovely. Thank you, Sherry, so much for your ministry. We are right in the middle of chapter 12 now. Our next presentation, we're going to finish up the chapter, and it gets more interesting, it gets more intense, and still has good news for you. Will you share in the victory Christ has provided for his church and for his people? Blessings to you. Take care till we meet again. Thanks.